In this example, I want to talk about how loans work, and that concept of gap is going to come back. So, what happens, and you might remember this from doing hire purchase in grade 9, is that when you take out a loan, sometimes there's a deposit. And what's really important to remember about a deposit is, first of all, it won't always be called a deposit. That's coming up now. But the deposit, there's no interest charged on that, which means it has to be subtracted from the amount that you're going to put into an interest calculation. Okay, so the other way that they do that is they say payment starts immediately. So remember the cell phone contract idea? You go to the shop, you get the contract, but you only start paying for it a month later. It works the same for a car loan or any other kind of loan, a home loan. You go and get it, but you don't start paying immediately. If you do pay immediately, then this comes into play. You have to take the first payment as a deposit. You have to subtract it from the amount borrowed and only put the rest into an interest calculation. So what I'm going to show you here is one where that doesn't happen, and then I'm going to change it into one where it does happen. So let's start with Bob taking out a 1-year bank loan to pay for a laptop. The interest rate is 18% compounded monthly, which is a little high, I must say. And then he does those repayments. And here, just thought I'd change it up a little bit. What we're going to do is we're going to calculate the amount of the loan or the cost of the laptop. Okay. There's a specific instruction here to calculate to the nearest rand, and that is because what we want to do is then work with that amount later. Okay, right, so I'm going to ask the question PV or FV again, and obviously you can see exactly what I'm planning on doing. I'm planning on using PV, but why? Where is the lump sum? Where is the lump sum? Is it coming sometime in the future because of payments that are being made now? Or do I have the money now and then I'm going to be paying in the future? And if I'm going to borrow money, it means that I have the big money now. I've got the lump sum now. And the lump sum is actually what we're calculating. Okay, so I don't know how much it is. I need to know what the value of the appliance is, and I'm going to put all of these numbers into a PV calculation. Just a word about the 12. Where does that thing come from? Well, we were told he takes out a 1-year bank loan. So that's a little unusual, and I think it's worthwhile making a point of it. So that's why I have 12 in my N. Okay, and when we type this all out, we get an answer that's just over 18,000 Rand. It's 18,000,00139. Right, so that part is normal. We've done that before. I just want to show you what happens if we now changed up a little bit. Okay, so we know the thing is 18,000 Rand, and we've rounded off to the nearest. Rand. So I'm going to change it up. I'm going to say, how would the time frame differ if he started paying immediately? So that means that there's a certain amount of deposit which needs to be subtracted first. Okay, and I want to change the installment to 2,000 Rand per month. Right, so what was the laptop's price again? It was 18,000. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract my first payment. Okay, which means the amount borrowed is now 16,000 Rand. So yeah, the laptop cost a bit more than the 16,000, but I'm only borrowing 16,000 Rand from the place that's lending me the money. It works very much the same for house prices. You will only borrow the amount that is left over after you've taken off the deposit. And the same for cars and anything else where there's a deposit. Okay, so now I want to know how would the time frame differ. So what am I doing? Here, I'm calculating N because I want to know, assuming now, how much time would he save? How much less time could he pay this off in if he had a higher payment and if the payment started a little sooner and we had a deposit as a result? Okay, so now I'm going to take 16,000 And I'm going to put that into the PV amount along with everything else. Again, here I am solving for n, so my process will be to take the 16,000, multiply it by the 0.18 over 12, and that gives me 240. And then I have that as the 2,000. Now I'm going to multiply out what's in here, and it's going to be 1 minus, and then I'm going to add that up, which is 1,015 to the negative n. And then I'm going to take the 240 and divide it by 2,000. That gives me 0,12. And then that has 1 minus this thing that's left over. Okay, so then subtracting 1 from both sides, this obviously is going to be negative now. So I'm going to have negative 0,88 equals negative 1,015 to the negative n. Then the negatives both cancel. And now we can do a log. So we're going to have negative n there. And our log is, with the base it's the same. The base is always the base. And that'll be 0,88. Okay, this will give us a negative answer. We're going to have negative n equals negative 8,5859. It goes on a bit. So I know that n is going to be about 9 months. And it was 12, right? So my answer is it will take 3 months less time. In the next question, I want to talk about gap again. So there's an expected gap in a particular financial arrangement, and then you have what we can call a deferred payment, or I'm going to call it an unexpected gap. So it's going to be a bit longer, and the basic idea is that when you have the unexpected gap, or you have the later payment or the deferred annuity, they also sometimes call it, is that the lump sum that you were borrowing, right, that incurs interest before you even pay it off, right, before the first installment. So what does that actually mean? It means if I borrow 100,000 Rand, I'm actually borrowing more, because that 100,000 Rand is going to be higher before I start paying it off. And that's something I feel quite strongly about. They often put it into car adverts and they say you only have to start paying in April if you buy the thing in January, and basically they're just telling you we're going to add more interest. But they don't really spell that out. I find that quite immoral, the way that it's done. So I guess that's why we teach this, so that you can avoid being ripped off in your future. So right, the guy takes out a 20-year loan of 100,000 Rand. It's a bit long, but anyway. He repays the loan by means of equal monthly payments, but this time they start 3 months after the granting of the loan. Okay, let's talk about what normal is. We are mostly dealing with monthly, but you will see that there's quarterly and half-yearly questions as well. So let's talk about normal. If you pay monthly, you're expecting a 1-month gap, and the PV formula accounts for that. So it is dealing with an expected gap in your payment, because if there isn't that expected gap, you're going to have the situation that we had in the previous question, which is you need to take money off because it's actually a deposit, right? Okay, but if you're paying quarterly, the normal gap would be 3-month gap. And if you're paying half yearly, the normal gap would be a 6-month gap. So be careful of these guys. Sometimes they trip you up. Okay. You need to just double check and have an idea in your mind. What is the normal gap I'm expecting? And then what's the gap they're telling me is actually occurring in the situation? Right. So this guy is repaying by monthly payments. So I'm expecting a 1-month gap. But what I get instead is I get a 3-month gap. So what does that mean? That means there's an extra 2 months, not an extra 3 months, and this is a little confusing. There's an extra 2 months that are happening. Not just happening, they are incurring interest. So what you need to do is stick it into the normal compound interest formula, grow it to beyond 100,000 Rand, and only then can it go into the PV formula to decide how much he's going to pay every single month. Before I go into that calculation, I'm going to ask this question, PV or FV. Obviously you know that it's going to be PV because it's a loan, but what's my logic? My logic is he takes out a 20-year loan. Where is the money? The money, the lump sum, this money is in the present. He's got it now. He's got the money in the present, so we use present value formula. Okay, so step number 1, I'm taking my 100,000 Rand that he thinks he borrowed, because it's not going to be that, it's going to be more. And I'm putting it into normal compound interest. Why does it go into normal compound interest and not into like an FV or a PV? The reason is no payments. You see, the only time you need FV or PV is when you've got payments. Now there's no payments. This thing is just growing. This lump sum in the present, it is growing and incurring extra interest before Bob decides to start paying it off. Right, so what's my N? Well, I'm expecting a 1-month gap. So 1-month gap means I don't have to do this whole growing calculation at all. But what's happening is I'm now getting a 3-month gap. So what's the extra? The extra is the 2. So I need to grow this for 2 months so that I can have the extra 2 months worth of interest. Okay, so that amount is actually the amount that it's growing to. Okay, so it's not 100,000 Rand he ended up borrowing. He ended up borrowing more. Right, what was the question? I want to calculate the monthly payments. The rest is relatively straightforward. I'm saying I don't know the monthly repayments, and I'm subbing in everything else exactly the way that I normally would in a PV calculation. I've left out the N value because that needs some thinking as well. So he's having less payments. Does that make sense? This was a 20-year loan, so it should have been 240 payments. But now we know he only started 3 months later. If he'd started 1 month later, it would have been 240 payments. But he started an extra 2 months later. So that means he's got less payments. So how many? Think about it. Should have been 240, but there's 2 missing. So what we have is we have 238 payments left. Okay, so what he's done is he's actually reduced the number of payments, but increased the amount he's actually paying off. If you reduce the number of payments and you pay things off quicker, you should actually reduce the capital, but that's not how it works when you defer the payment. You actually make things a lot more difficult for yourself financially. Okay, so going through the motions here, my left-hand side multiplied out gives me that, and then on the right-hand side I'm going to leave my x and I'm going to type everything else into the calculator, and I get this really long decimal here, 64.73918309. You don't have to do all these steps, and so then I'm just dividing through and I get x is 1591,35 Rand per month. For interest's sake, let's figure out how much he actually ends up paying off on this loan. If we take the 1591,35, how many times did he pay that? He paid it 238 times. This is now to borrow 100,000 Rand, right? And there it is. It's going to pay off nearly 400,000 Rand. Look, it's a very high interest rate. It's over a very long period of time. It's a bit unrealistic in our current economy. But we need to know what time does to money. It really is quite a frightening concept. So what you'll see, and the reason I've done this calculation, is sometimes you might need to compare investments or loans. Okay, so when you do that, what you want to do is you want to calculate the total amount paid like we just did. So say there were 2 different kinds of loans that were offered Bob, and you had to work out which one was better. The most effective way of doing that is to figure out how much the person has to pay overall. But there are other things to consider. So if there's a time period that's a lot shorter, it normally means the amount that you pay back is incredibly high, and people might not be able to afford that. So there's always 2 ways of looking at it, looking at the time and looking at the money. Here, this guy has an inordinate amount of time to pay back 100,000 Rand. It really is a huge amount of time. So he pays so little per month, but he ends up paying nearly 4 times the price. And that's what happens to us when we take out home loans. We get 20 or 30 years to pay off a loan, and we end up paying off so much more of it. So if you pay things off over less time, you tend to save money. But if you have more time to pay, then it's something that can be more reasonably fitted into your budget. So that's how to compare them if you're ever asked to do that.